Hi, I'm josephrlewis and I write adventures. And when I'm writing an adventure, I get to make lots of choices about the stuff that goes in the adventure. I get to choose the locations and the people that the players will talk to, the challenges they'll overcome, the dangers, the environment, the hazards, the rewards and the treasures they'll earn. But I also get to include a lot of monsters because D&D tends to be a game about fighting monsters. So I get to choose what monsters go in the adventure, but I also get to choose how many. And that's kind of an important point that I want to talk about today. How many monsters do we put in an adventure? Because we might be putting too many in. Now, I've found that there are basically two ways that I decide what monsters go in an adventure. First is necessity. If I write an adventure called The Cruel Talons of the Harpy, then I probably have to put a harpy in that adventure. And these types of monsters tend to be hanging out in very specific locations that are plot related, and they're doing something that is plot related, and that's simple enough. And second, there are monsters that are there because they seem vaguely cool and generally appropriate to the setting or the story. So if there's one undead, then I might have a lot more random undead creatures alongside it. And if the adventure's inside a cave, then there might be a bunch of random cave dwellers alongside it. And these tend to be monsters that are hanging out in the random encounters table. And they might show up anywhere, or they might not show up at all. Generally, my experience has been that the bigger an adventure is, the more types of monsters there will be in that adventure, or at least in the text. But I want to challenge that idea. I'm not sure that's right. Do we really need a whole zoo full of monsters and baddies in one adventure? And perhaps more importantly, do we even want to have that many? So here's my pitch for having fewer different monsters in your adventures. And let's look at books and film and just ask, what monsters do our heroes in culture actually fight? How many stat blocks would we actually need to run an adventure in this book or this movie? So first off, here are some pieces of media where I think you only need one stat block if you were to run an adventure styled on this piece of media. So first off, there is almost every zombie movie ever made. In any given zombie movie, there's pretty much just one type of zombie. It has one set of abilities and one set of weaknesses, and that's it. And that's fine. We love zombie movies. One stat block works. Next up is almost every vampire movie. In any given vampire movie, I think you only need one stat block. They all tend to have the same set of powers and the same set of weaknesses, and that seems to work just fine throughout the entire length of the adventure of those movies or books. For the next one, let's get a little more specific. The 1981 film Dragon Slayer. If this was an adventure at the table, how many stat blocks would we need? I think just one, and that's for human soldiers, human warriors. And you're probably thinking, wait, shouldn't there be a dragon stat block in Dragon Slayer? My answer is no. You don't fight the dragon in Dragon Slayer with, swords and spears. You don't wear down its hit points until it finally falls down. You have to figure out what weapon, the special weapon that will defeat it. You have to figure out the circumstances by which you can use that weapon, and then you have to carry out a cunning plan to make it all come together. And that's a puzzle. That's a challenge. That's not combat, and you don't need a stat block for it. And lastly, for my single stat block examples, I would say The Wizard of Oz. If we were running that adventure, I think the only stat block we would need were the flying monkeys. Again, the witch, you don't fight the witch. Again, this is one of those people who has a weakness, and you need to figure out the weakness, and then execute a cunning plan, or chuck a buck of water at her, and you overcome her. She's a puzzle, a challenge to be solved. So again, that's very few stat blocks to cover a lot of our classic media touchstones. Here are some examples of things that I think would need 2 stat blocks. First up, Lord of the Rings. I think you only need humans and orcs. I think. You don't really fight anyone else. You're not going to fight the Balrog. Gandalf, the NPC, is going to do that off screen. You're not going to fight the Watcher in the water. Even if you try to fight Shelob, you're going to scare her off with a magic item. Pretty much the only things you fight, like fight, are the bad humans and the orcs, I think. Next up are the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. In those, or at least in the first one for sure, you need one stat block for bad humans and one for skeletons or some kind of zombie, whatever you want to call those guys. You're not going to fight the Kraken or any of those other giant, mystical, magical, powerful things. You're pretty much going to be fighting people, alive or dead. That's just 2 stat blocks. Next up, Game of Thrones, the books or the show, whichever you would like. I think you only need 2 stat blocks, one for humans and one for the White Walkers. Those are the only things you would really fight. You're definitely not going to fight the dragons. And I don't think there are any other monsters in those, although you could correct me, I don't remember. You could make the argument that maybe you need 2 stat blocks for humans, maybe some kind of soldier versus some kind of knight. That's fair. Maybe 2.5 stat blocks for all of Game of Thrones. Next up, Conan the Barbarian, some of my favorite pulp stories, some of the foundational writings for our hobby. I think you can get away with just 2 stat blocks for most Conan stories. Generally, there's some human fighters of some kind, and then sometimes there's a giant animal, giant snake, giant ape, something like that. Not much else. I think you can do just about any Conan story with just 2 stat blocks. And lastly, The Hobbit. I love The Hobbit. I love The Hobbit more than Lord of the Rings. It's very fairy tale, and it's close to my heart. But again, I think you could do The Hobbit with just 2 stat blocks, and that would be the orcs and the spiders. You don't fight the trolls, you outsmart the trolls. You don't fight Bjorn, you outsmart Bjorn. You definitely don't fight Smaug. You figure out his weakness, and you communicate that to the right person, and you organize it for it to happen at just the right time with just the right weapon. It's a puzzle to be solved. It's a challenge. It's not a stat block related combat. That's a bunch of things where you only need 1 or 2 stat blocks to do the whole piece of media. But I did come up with 2 examples of things where you do need more than 2 stat blocks, I think, to play out those scenarios. The first is the 1963 film Jason and the Argonauts, classic Ray Harryhausen film. If you've not seen it, I think you owe it to yourself to do so. It's lovely. It holds up well for its style, for its time. But if you were going to play Jason and the Argonauts, of course, this is classic Greek myth nonsense. You need some evil humans. You need harpies, the Hydra, and the skeletons. That's just 4. There's a giant bronze statue. Again, you outsmart that. It's a puzzle to solve. What else is there? There are a bunch of gods fighting. And again, you can't fight the gods. You have to negotiate and outsmart them. There are problems to be solved, puzzles to solve. So you can all do that with just 4 stat blocks. And my last example is Clash of the Titans from 1981, another classic film that, if you've not seen it, I encourage you to see it. It's pretty great. And to play out that, again, Greek myth fantasy adventure, I think you need a human stat block, Medusa, poor Medusa, a 2-headed dog, which I actually don't remember, but it's there, giant scorpions, and the beast man Calibos. So 5 stat blocks for that entire film. So you can absolutely create a big epic adventure with less than half a dozen stat blocks. Why does this matter? What is the virtue in fewer stat blocks? Let's talk about that. First off, fewer stat blocks means less work for the GM at the table. They don't need to read as much. They don't need to remember as much. They can focus all their energy on running the interaction with just the little piece of information that's related to the one monster or the 2 monsters. And this means they can make the interaction, the combat, more dynamic and more interesting because they don't have to remember all of the different things that all of these different bad guys can do. They can just weave one interesting bad guy into a more interesting scenario. Second, having fewer types of monsters mean the players will have more opportunities to interact with those monsters, the same monsters, over and over again. Isn't that boring, you ask? No. Not unless you have boring monsters. If your monsters have a couple cool abilities and maybe some interesting weaknesses, then having more opportunities to keep fighting that monster means that the GM gets better at showing off those abilities or has more opportunities to show off those abilities before the baddies die. And the players get to see those abilities, get to be wowed and interested, but they learn the weaknesses and then they get smarter, more effective at fighting these bad guys. And that feels great when you learn the rules and then overcome the challenges by mastering the rules. That's fantastic. And you have more opportunities to do that if you have fewer monsters. So the next time you're planning out an adventure, I challenge you, or you can challenge yourself, to use fewer monsters. Having a small number of cool, flavorful monsters can make an adventure more memorable and more thematic because it's focused on that type of monster. It can be the lava spider adventure. It can be the giggling shadow adventure. It's the something that will really grab hold of their imaginations and make it stand out and be unique and memorable. But what do I know? I put 53 stat blocks in Carcassonne. I put 83 stat blocks in the Undying Sea. So, well, I think that's all for now. So, good luck out there.